Welcome. I'm delighted to be here with you. My name is Mentor Ate, and today we're going to be talking about investing. But more specifically, we're going to be talking about investing in digital assets and investing in what I consider to be a very interesting asset class. Now, I'm going to go back to the basics. I hope you don't mind. If you're an experienced investor, perhaps you are an institutional investor or you're a retail investor, you might find a lot of what I share at the start to be somewhat elementary. On the other hand, if you are, let's say, a new beginner, and you're looking for ideas and insights that can guide you instructively, then I believe you're going to find today's session to be very interesting. What is investing? Well, let's just put away the definitions we've heard from so many interested and also very exceptional investors to one side, and let's talk about investing from a very basic point of view. I define investing as simply putting out money with the expectation of getting something back in return. It's a very simple definition, but that definition is incomplete because you want three questions answered. Number one, when am I going to get my original principal back? Number two, what is the degree of certainty that I'm going to get the money back? And number three, what do I get back in return for taking that risk? Three simple questions you want answered. If you can answer the three questions, then I call that investing. If you can't, then I call it by a different name, speculation. Now, there's nothing wrong with speculation. As a matter of fact, anyone who's experienced as an investor recognizes that in every investment asset class, that there is some degree of speculation. I believe that there is a razor's edge between investing and speculating. It's a very thin line, but that thin edge is defined by two interesting concepts. One is risk, one is uncertainty. To the degree that you have a lot of certainty in what you're investing in, we call that investing. To the degree that that uncertainty, or that certainty in this case, is reduced, then becoming uncertainty, we call that speculating. So with investing, you want to know what you're going to put out. You're going to know you're going to get it back in terms of your principal investment. You want to know when exactly you're going to get it back. You want to know what you're going to get in return. And where there is low risk and high certainty that those three answers will be fulfilled, then you are investing. You're intelligently putting money out for a purpose. On the other hand, where the risk is much higher and the level of certainty is much lower, and therefore uncertainty very high, we call that speculation. Nothing wrong, as long as you define the activity you're engaging in for what it is. Now, I started my investment journey in the traditional asset class. And by asset class, I'm talking about real assets and stocks and bonds. And by real assets, I'm referring to real estate or commodities, whatever you want to call those. And a number of years ago, I came across a very fascinating concept. It was called digital assets. And that intrigued me. And I decided that I was going to look into it a little bit. Now, let me give you some background as to who I am. I know you haven't asked, but I think it will lay a good foundation. I'm an engineer by training. I worked in engineering for a number of years. And then I retired from engineering to pursue investing. So I started out as an engineer. I became a retail investor. Now, for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with what the definition of a retail investor means, it's simply someone who invests their own money for personal gain. Now, you could do that actively or you could do it passively. And after a number of years of investing, I guess I started sharing some ideas with a few people, and some people said, well, we want to give you some money to invest as well. So I moved from a retail investor and I created what's called a small private equity fund, like a family office where I could manage my assets, but also manage assets for other people. And that meant that I started seeing investing slightly differently. In other words, I had responsibilities that exceeded just myself. Now, I began with property investing. Some people call it real estate. And I did that for a simple reason. My experience under just close to 15 years of working in the construction industry was primarily designing and constructing buildings all over the world. I began with what I understood. And this is where the lecture today begins, or where I should say some of my ideas will be laid out on the table. The first principle of investing is defining what you understand. I call this defining your area of competence. Understanding the edge of that area for a reason. Now, I could have started in a different asset class, but I knew nothing about those asset classes. I had to start with what I knew. And after a number of years of investing, I decided that I was going to expand my area of competence. And so I moved into securities, stocks primarily, and then bonds. But in each step of the way, I had to educate myself. So, for those of you who are interested in investing, my first question to anyone who says, I want to be an investor, I always tend to ask them to do one thing and one thing alone. Don't start investing your resources in an asset. Invest in yourself. Decide what you want to invest in and take a portion of what you have. I believe between 5 and 10%, and invest in yourself so that you can define what you understand and what, more importantly, you can make an educated and an intelligent decision on a financial basis. It all comes down to judgment, but interestingly, skill and talent plays a big role. So I moved from traditional investing in properties and securities, and I came across, I should say, digital assets. Fascinating concepts. And so I started to invest. Initially, I must admit to you, I wasn't really using the word investing. I was kind of gambling. I just said, just put in a few pounds in there and just see what happens. And I found something interesting. That's what I want to talk about. In a short while, I found that it suddenly started providing a return that far exceeded my expectation, and got to the point where the little that I put in the digital assets now represented a significant proportion of my net worth. And that got my attention. As soon as it got my attention, I had to go back to the basics. And the first question I asked myself was, what do I know about digital assets? What do I know about investing in this space? And the answer was, I know nothing. And so I decided again to expand my circle of competence, to start learning about digital assets, the technology, and the use cases. But more importantly, I decided to bring in what had guided me so far in all my investment journey, which are really my philosophies and principles, and use those for digital asset investing. Now, for those of you who are new to this space, and for those of you who are perhaps experienced, I hope you already understand it, but if you don't, I hate to be the one who gets to tell you this. Digital asset investing, as of today, is a speculative investment process. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you call it for what it is. Now, you'll find as we go along today's session and in the subsequent sessions, I'm going to use the word investing. But I use that word simply because it's one that I'm familiar with. But I will say this. Investing in digital assets, investing in the technology, whether blockchain or hashgraph, investing in cryptocurrencies, whether first, second, third generation or beyond, is a speculative process. However, the key to success is taking investment principles, investment philosophies, investment strategies, and embedding those strategies in your speculative journey. And that way, you wouldn't be trying to predict, you'll be making decisions that are based on sound ideas and experiences, but also you'll be making decisions that will be successful. And that's what I'm going to try and do as we go along. So let me summarize by saying this. If you want to be an investor, one of the first things you must do is recognize that there is a science to wealth. But investing is not a science. Investing is an art. Two different things. With wealth, becoming financially free, there are principles, there are rules, there are laws. But if you obey and apply them, you can predict with some level of mathematical certainty the outcomes. You can't do that with investing. Investing is somewhat counterintuitive. It turns on itself. There's a lot of randomness. Sometimes you can be precise and sometimes it can be imprecise. And the reason is simply because investing is an art. And you and I have to learn the art of successful investing. And part of the art form of it, as you might see, this is like a blank canvas, is deciding what colors and spectrums you're going to use to paint your masterpiece. You see, my investment approach will be different from yours. There is no one answer that answers, or one strategy or philosophy that is the underlying response or answer to everyone's approach. We're all different. So as you come on this journey with me, one of the things I like to perhaps encourage you to do is learn how to be an independent thinker. I'm going to share my ideas. I'm going to share my philosophies. But I want to make a point to you. No one has all the answers. My philosophy might work for me, but you have to find a philosophy that works with your character, your personality, and who you are. We're all different. I find it fascinating that we have 7 billion people in the world today who are alive. And each and every one of us is different. I think that's beautiful. Each and every one of us potentially can come to the same conclusion, but the thinking process by which we make those decisions will vary. We might get to the same end, but the means will vary, and that is so unique. And the reason is because you're different. So as an investor, what you have to understand first of all is yourself. Once you understand yourself, then you can find the principles and the strategies and the philosophies to embed in your personality, and that will guide you towards making the right investment approach and decisions. And I hope you do. I wish you all the best.